There we go. That sounds better. All right, I think we're going to start. A few things at the beginning. First of all, thank you all for coming to my talk. Also, turn off all cell phones, yada, yada, yada. I want to ask, how many of you people went to Ralph Koster's talk yesterday about small worlds and social systems? Good. Okay, it was an excellent talk. Purposely, I'm going to avoid most of that stuff on the assumption that if you're interested, you would have gone to his talk. He also kind of made a point of how fast he was going to go through his talk. And perhaps we have different definitions of fast, but this talk is going to go really fast. Louder? Okay. How's that? Okay. So I kind of apologize for how fast I'm going to go through this talk. Part of it was, when I picked the topic, I think I underestimated the breadth of it. Probably bit off a little more than I could chew. But I'm going to post these slides on the net. I'll give you the address at the end of the talk. So if you want to basically inflict this on yourself at a later date at a more leisurely pace, then feel free to download it. Also, how many of you came to this talk looking for hard-hitting, pragmatic advice on how to make better games? That's a shame. My talks aren't like that. Like my games, they tend to be rather kind of aimless and open-ended. So just kind of take that for what it's worth. Okay, so let's get started here. The official title of my talk is Dynamics for Designers. But this is kind of the unofficial title of my talk. And this is kind of the unofficial subtitle of it. Basically, we work together in teams, put together content, programming, to make games. The player takes our game, goes into this possibility space, and they explore all these branches, all these things, and that's 1, 2, 3. That's the essence of gameplay, is players coming to these worlds that kind of expand into this space. Now, recent games, I think the trend is heading toward open-ended emergent games, games that have a much richer possibility space. And it's kind of interesting, as a player, you can come into one of these spaces, and any person can, in a very short period of time, get a sense for how big that space is, what the boundaries are. I remember the first time I played Grand Theft Auto 3, at first it was, people walking around in cars, and no big deal, I've seen this before. But about 5 minutes into that game, it was like, whoa, this is pretty cool. Just through a few interactions, I was able to intuit the size of that possibility space. And I think any player can do this. So our typical approach to building larger, more dynamic spaces has been to enlist legions of developers creating them. And I think they can only carry us so far, and I think we're hitting those limits right now. So really, this talk is about how we use emergence to engineer larger possibility spaces with simpler components. Now, a couple of definitions here really quick. I use structure to mean kind of the snapshot of a system. What are the constituent parts that if you just froze it in time, you could look at and say that's the structure of a system? Dynamics are the way those parts interact through time, either the way they interact or the cyclic relationships, life cycle, even catastrophic changes that can occur to a system through time. And models I use very widely to mean both the models we build in the computer and also the models that we build in our heads. Something very unique about humans is that we model the world around us all the time. We're always imagining what's going to happen next. What if I do A instead of B? What's the outcome going to be? In fact, science really is a modeling activity. Science is all about how do we look at the world around us and compress it into the simplest, most elegant rules that we possibly can. I can measure, the course of the planets and accumulate vast reams of data on that, but that data can actually be compressed down into Newton's laws of gravity very elegantly. And up to now, science has basically used kind of traditional math as its primary modeling method. And it's been able to do amazing things, but it's hit some real limits as of late, especially as we start understanding and trying to understand more complex, interesting systems. And so recently, since the advent of the computer, simulation has kind of emerged as an alternate method for building these models. They're fundamentally pretty different. Math is really more of a linear process. We have these fairly elaborate equations, and we run the numbers through, turn the crank, get answers. Simulation really is a more parallel process. It's generally simpler ideas, simpler components interacting together in kind of parallel to create a lot of the same things. And in fact, simulation is turning out to be able to handle things that traditional math had real difficulty with, things like economic systems and biological systems. There's kind of an interesting parallel here between story and gameplay. Story is a way that we can transmit experience to one another. It's a communication form, but it's very linear. I can give you, a linear path through a possibility space, and then you can kind of, elaborate, remember that in your head. Gameplay is a way to communicate a possibility space through parallel. Users actually put into the space, and they can take all these parallel branches through it and actually feel the size of that possibility space. Just to illustrate kind of the differences between the two modeling techniques, traditional math, if we had, let's say, a square mile of land and we planted some crops on it, standard math would probably go in here, measure the size of each of these things. That ellipsoid would be, kind of problematic. And there'd be kind of a long equation that you'd run all the numbers through to calculate what area of this plot of land was covered by fields. Using modeling techniques, we'd probably do something much stupider. We'd start throwing darts at it randomly. And after we threw a certain number of darts, we would then measure how many of the darts landed in a field and how many landed outside of a field. And that ratio would tell us, what percentage of the area here was occupied by crops. As we throw more darts, we get a more accurate answer. And as you can see, this, in some sense, on the surface is a kind of a stupid approach. But using the power of a computer, this can actually give you very good results. This is called, by the way, the Monte Carlo technique for kind of obvious reasons. This is a stochastic method, which is kind of in simulation. Stochastic means there's some amount of randomness involved. The same run of the model won't always get the same exact result. So basically, as designers, we have these dynamic spaces. There's this vast, landscape of dynamic spaces that we can put into our games. And we cut off little chunks of that space with rule sets that we build our games around. So as a designer, one of the things I like to do is explore this space and figure out which dynamics are out there that would make for interesting gameplay. So part of this talk, I'm going to be using prototypes to show you examples of how we map this space. The way I view prototypes basically is the same as paratroopers. We just drop these little paratroopers at what we think might be interesting spots on the landscape. When they land, we can kind of start playing with the prototype and seeing how interesting was that space actually, and then start iterating the prototype uphill, into more interesting regions. And so the prototypes, in some sense, are kind of hill climbing things in local regions of this dynamic space. Now, I like to use dynamics almost like Legos. For me, they're these little components that you stick together, and you combine them in interesting ways to make novel new things. And like most people, when I have Legos at home, I have a big box, and I just basically pile all my Legos into it. When I want to play with them, I dump the box out and start sorting through them and looking for things. I've actually got a friend, and for him, Legos is like a religion or something. And he approaches Legos in an entirely different way. He's got this huge, tackle box, and he sorts his Legos by color and by size and everything. He's extremely meticulous about it. It's kind of scary. But when he just had a kid, so I'm wondering how long that's going to last. But so when I decided to do this talk, I decided to take my little unsorted box of Legos and see if I could put some structure around it. All these dynamics that I just kind of use instinctively, could I figure out some way to arrange them that made sense? And so kind of what I came up with is this three-sided cube. And this is kind of how the talk is roughly organized. One side of this cube is topologies. These are kind of the way things are connected. These are the three that I primarily use: agents, networks, and layers. Now, those basically get changed through dynamics. Any one of these dynamics can apply to any one of these topologies. And the third side of this is basically kind of the glue. It's what I call paradigms. These are the different ways in which these dynamics are mapped to the topologies. And these basically have kind of a historical order. And I'm going to go kind of in the order that they were invented, starting with cybernetics, working up to network theory. But looking at this cube, what is the most logical way to kind of present this information? Because it is all cross-intersecting. It's very dense. And unfortunately, the best thing I came up with was something kind of like this. So forgive me. We'll start with topologies. Topologies really talk about the relationships between objects. They can be functional relationships, spatial, over time. This top line up here, could be a story with chapters. This could be a choose-your-own-adventure game, with branching points through time. This bottom topology might represent a level-based game, where you're basically, it's kind of open-ended between the levels, but at the end of each level, you have to find the red key to get through the door, so it collapses back to these kind of pinch points. Now, basically, the way I've organized this is I've put these topologies in order of flexibility. Agents I think of as things that have very flexible relationships that change very often through time. Networks are a little bit more persistent. They can add and break links, but they're a little more persistent than agent relationships. And networks are probably the least persistent. The most persistent. Those are, you always have the same neighbors on a given spot. You can look at something like people represented in games, and I think people in The Sims are best thought of in terms of an agent, the way they move around, and they're fairly fluid with each other. In The Sims Online, I tend to actually think of the players in terms of networks, because they establish these long-term boundaries, these relationships they group together in houses or clubs, whatever. And People in SimCity, in fact, are just statistical clouds. So they're, in fact, represented with a two-dimensional array, which is a layer. So every part of your game can kind of be represented, I think, in some way with one of these topologies. You can pick almost any game component and understand it in terms of one of these topologies. Now the dynamics which are applied to these are a bit more varied, and they don't sort quite as easily. First one I want to talk about, just very briefly, is growth. You can have growth of agents. They can grow in size, or they can grow in number. Networks, you can add more nodes to a network, or you can add more links between the existing nodes. And in layers, you typically get forms of propagation that tend to center around a certain spot and spread outward under some rule set. Growth comes in many forms, but they all share a lot of the same characteristics. If you're on the highway and it's starting to get nighttime, it's getting a little bit darker, a few cars have their lights on. It gets a little bit darker, a few more cars have their lights on, and pretty soon everybody has their lights on except for a few cars. There's this very rapid phase transition that occurs that's frequently referred to as the tipping point. This is the shape of that curve, and a lot of calculus is actually built around trying to build curves like this, naturalistic curves that can map to nature. But in fact, we can get the same curves using very stupid, simple simulation dynamics. This thing above, this grid, is time steps in a simulation. And the rule here is that for every cell, try to add another cell nearby on the next time step. And so it doubles, basically, up to the point where it starts running out of room. And that simulation will generate pretty much the same curve. This is a curve of human population growth. And you can see it's going to take the same shape. And we don't know where it's going to top out here, but that's kind of one of the interesting questions that simulation's been trying to answer over the years. This is another curve, just to show you that a very simple rule set can generate almost any shaped curve you want here. This could represent the pull of gravity or a rocket trajectory. And the rule above is just throw random darts at the grid, and if they hit, make a new cell. And it'll give you a curve just like that. Now, propagation is really a form of movement. It can be movement of material, information, or patterns through a system. Take a road, for example. You have cars on the road moving cargo down the road. Information can be transmitted down the road. But we've also got patterns that are, in some sense, independent of what's in the agents going down the road. And I mean traffic compression patterns, where some cars will slow down, and the cars behind them will slow down. And if you kind of zoom way out in a traffic helicopter, you'll see what look like sound waves propagating down the highway. And that's a pattern that's propagating through this. Patterns and things frequently propagate through networks. That's the main reason for networks to exist, actually. Through layers, there's a medium, usually, that propagation occurs through. We think of it as propagating through space, but it's also, of course, propagating through time. There's something that physicists use called light cone. And this is a view of time where the future is on the top, the past is on the bottom, and now is in the middle. And this is basically showing what you can impact from where you are in this space-time into the future and what you could have impacted into the past. You can actually understand a certain game where, let's say, you have to complete a level in a certain period of time. And what the player is doing really is they're trying to keep the goal state inside the cone. At any point, if that goal state leaves the cone in the future side, that means there's no way they can get to it. It's outside their kind of event horizon. So this is a good way for looking at games way back in terms of the propagation of the player's decisions and the player's point in the space. Vector fields are another type of propagation where it's a directed propagation, usually from a layer. And it can be directing agents or other things. I'm going to show you the first demo here. This demo was created by Ed Goldman, and it just kind of illustrates. Here we go. So basically, this is a very simple system where I can push things around with the mouse. Now, what we have here is we have a layer underneath, which is the vector layer. As I move the mouse around, not only am I pushing the agents on top of this, but I'm also propagating patterns through the underlying field. So here we're seeing propagation of the agents above the layer, and we're seeing propagations of the flow patterns underneath the layer. But systems like this can give you very natural, organic, very complex behavior, again, using just extremely simple rules. And those are the type of things that we really need to be, I think, leveraging more in games. When we did Sim Earth, we actually had a vector flow model for the ocean currents. And when we turned it on, we got this cold current off the coast of Chile. And you can't imagine how excited I got about that. I mean, it was just, I'm sure you can't imagine how excited I got about that. because it was an emergent dynamic. I didn't plan for that to happen. And if it surprises the designer, it's pretty cool. But when it surprises the programmer, and I was the one that programmed this, then it's very cool, because even the programmer wasn't foreseeing the interesting emergent dynamics coming out of the components that you were in fact building. Propagation can also be used to understand communities. There's a certain type of horizontal propagation that can happen through a community. We see this a lot in something like the Sims Online or even the offline version of the community. When there's a new feature that we drop into the game, it takes time for it to propagate, usually from the hardcore to the more casual players. And not only is it kind of moving from one to the other, but it's kind of changing. The wave of the impact that this feature has, with the hardcore players, they get totally into it, and they just totally, use it 24 hours a day. And as it moves toward the casual players, they think it's kind of cool, but not as cool as the hardcore people thought. And so the wave the wave amplitude is actually getting shorter as it hits the casual players, but at the same time, it's also getting a longer wavelength. The casual players don't get into it as intensely, but they actually play with it a lot longer. And so understanding the way these patterns can change, as they propagate is kind of important, and especially in social systems. There was one thing we had in the game where the Sims Online doesn't have fire in it, or so we thought, but the fans found this one object that if they did this, it was a rocket launcher, and they launched rockets over and over and over, they could finally start a fire. And slowly the word started to spread to the fans, and they started having these fire parties. And they would get together, and when they started a fire, they got so excited about it, But it was interesting to track the propagation of that through the community. There's another type of propagation that can occur primarily through networks, which is vertical propagation. Marvin Minsky actually used this in one of his models of the way the mind works, that we have these kind of agents in our brain, these very low-level agents, and if they cannot resolve their inputs, they send it up to the next highest level. And if that agent cannot resolve the inputs, it sends it to a higher level. It's almost like corporate delegation, where let's push it up to the vice president type of thing. But this is a form of vertical propagation through an information system. So a lot of these systems actually are striving for a balance between the global propagation of material or information and the local. There's a balance between the two. And this more recently has been much better understood in terms of network theory and scale-free networks, which I'll kind of mention later on. Ants are kind of an interesting example. I have an ant example for almost anything, by the way. They have this local communication where they drop pheromones. And they can change nearby ants' states. They can smell a pheromone and say, oh, food's nearby, or it's time to attack, or time to do nesting instinct. And so they have this very elaborate horizontal propagation of information through pheromones. But they do this other thing called trophallaxis, what happens is an ant will come up to another one and basically vomit up food, and then the other ant slurps it up. And so ants, in fact, have two stomachs. How cool is that? So they have this private stomach, which is where they actually digest, and they have this social stomach that they share the food with every other ant. Now, what this ends up being, they're global variables. It's how they do, it's like a global bulletin board system for the entire colony. For instance, the queen generates this very particular chemical that no other ant produces. And she does trophallaxis just like all the other ants. And what happens is over the course of maybe 2 hours, that little tracer chemical will disseminate through the entire colony. And if that chemical ever evaporates, because the queen's died or has been lost somehow, the entire ant colony instantly knows that they've lost their queen. And then they actually start a whole new behavior of promoting a new queen. So ants actually have a balance of communication here between the global and the local, the way they propagate information. Another form of propagation is through agents, maybe thought in terms of pollination. We see that actually as more overt game dynamics, even in recent titles like this one, where you're going around an Animal Crossing, and a lot of times you're gathering things, bringing them to somebody else. You can bring your card to somebody else's Animal Crossing and give them a fruit tree. And for the game players themselves, that propagation through agents is a major part of the gameplay. In the Sims fan community, they've been propagating skins and whatnot for years, and 80% of it's Britney Spears stuff. But for them, it's like a metagame on top of the Sims, and it's a big part of the experience. Now, grouping is the next dynamic I want to cover here. Grouping generally is driven by competitive pressures. Groups of agents or networks or whatnot will come together and start cooperating to be able to compete on a higher level. It's dependent upon economies of scale. The group of agents that are grouping together have to be more efficient than the individuals who are alone. It's enabled by certain communication and control structures that they need to coordinate their activities. And eventually, down the road, it encourages specialization. When we group similar items, we tend to call that classification. In a lot of games, you have groups of people, like in an RTS. I can treat these little individual soldiers and tell them to go off and do things, but I can also group them together, which achieves a higher level of abstraction. I can now think of this whole little group of people as one thing that I can direct, and so my command structure becomes leveraged. I jump up to a higher level of abstraction. I call this level jumping. Other games like Command & Conquer Generals, this one, the graphics were so pretty. I've been playing this lately. I don't even bother grouping them like that. I just make one huge group and then put them all into battle and sit back and watch. And so the Humvees take the brunt of the attack, and then the tanks show up, and then the infantry shows up at the end of the battle. But ants actually have a really cool grouping algorithm. One of the things that they do is they keep their larvae sorted by age. And frequently things will happen where the larvae get disordered because they had to move the colony or something. But they do it through just seemingly random behavior. They just randomly walk around, pick up larvae, and put them down. And over time, they end up perfectly sorted. And they investigated this, and what they found out was that ants, if they find a larva in an area giving off a particular scent, and that area has none of that scent around it, they'll tend to pick it up. And if they happen to be carrying a larva with a particular scent, and they get into an area that's high in that scent, from other larvae, they'll tend to put it down. And basically, those simple rules over time will sort amazingly efficiently. And so it's another great example of emergence that basically nature has discovered before us. Part of grouping is attraction. What's binding these things together? Flocking algorithms and schooling algorithms both are dependent on global and local communication. Don't bump into your neighbor, but stay somewhere near the herd. I'm going to show you another prototype here really quick. This one was created by Jason Schenkel at Maxis. It's called Particle Man. Now, this initially is kind of a gravity model. And what we have is a little sea of particles here moving around. They're gravitationally attracting each other. When they get close enough, they can actually fuse and become a larger particle. So you're seeing kind of the larger particles have deeper gravity wells. That's what the green grid represents. I can actually go in and directly interact with this tool. This is like a handy-dandy space-time tool. And so as I move this around, I'm actually kind of herding these things. But extremely simple rules for the way these things group, But because they can fuse, it brings up very interesting kind of dynamics. There are kind of a number of things I can kind of illustrate with this. This is a system of particles where basically each particle is still individually acting on the force of gravity, and they were set up in just such a way so they had a rotational velocity. So in fact, every particle is doing an elliptical orbit around that gravity well. But they give the illusion of this oscillating ring. Now, one of the coolest things about dynamics like this is the fact that when you see a system like this, you can't help but want to perturb it and screw it up. So like one little touch of space-time, and then I can watch what happened to the system. And these systems don't just say, OK, I'm broken, and they turn off. They actually become dysfunctional in very interesting, kind of complex ways. And so if we can put these systems in our games, that's the first thing our players are going to do with them is sit there and see how badly they can screw up the system and experience a very vast and interesting set of failure states. I'll show you another model here where, in this model, it's not even so much about the particles, it's more about the boundaries between the particles. We have particles here, and now they're not gravitationally interacting with each other. They're only interacting with my tool. So if I click the tool here, I can actually pull particles around. And in doing so, there's a boundary that's created basically by fields that the particles emit. And the summation of those fields around the particles defines this boundary. So in fact, here I'm kind of manipulating this three-dimensional shape by pulling the particles around. And so this is kind of a form of grouping where the boundary is more important than the constituents of the group. We see that actually in a lot of game dynamics also. Game of Go really, ends up being much more about boundaries. It's not really about who captured the most pieces at all, or how many pieces you have on the board. It's about the territories that you've captured. So sometimes the boundaries are the group, or the most important part of the group. Some groups are built upon similar items, grouping together. But at some level, they start generally transforming into specialized groups, groups of individual things that are specialized for a particular task. This usually happens when the coordination efforts between the members of a group is less than the inefficiencies of going it alone. It's also, specialization is really enabled by communication. advanced life, animals and whatnot, were really enabled by things like the neuron, which allowed specialized cells to communicate over very long distances and opened a much wider possibility space. One of the most important things about specialization is it breeds networks. Most of the networks around us are the result of trying to keep specialized systems operating, and they were invented by specialized systems around us. This is kind of a map of the auto industry. This might be Toyota in the middle with motor manufacturers, chassis manufacturer, and then smaller and smaller part suppliers. But they're all interdependent, but at the same time, they're kind of competing. There's, in fact, a balance that occurs in the specialized networks between cooperation and competition. And that balance is actually very critical. And there are usually mechanisms in there for maintaining that balance. In a specialized system, there are also different types of specialization going on concurrently. In a city, you're actually specializing your time. You might live in one place, you might work in another, you might eat over here, go over here for a movie. So your time is being specialized as an agent in the system. But at the same time, the land use of that city is specialized by its functional need. You have the places where where factories are producing things, the places where people are going to be entertained, and it's the mapping of these two specializations together, and then all the networks in the city can be understood in terms of these specializations transporting material and information. In games, we see this, of course, all the time. Especially in RTS-type games where there's growth, specialization, and networks. And the player is really directing this activity, and the player is encouraged to build that specialization. We see it also in fan communities. Fan communities are specialized networks of nodes. There's a critical mass that you kind of have to reach at each component level for this specialization to occur, and that's one of the things we really want to encourage when we're trying to build a fan community, is getting a critical mass for every node so that we can kind of emerge to that next level of specialization. But even in this, there is that balance between cooperation and competition. The webmasters, in some ways are cooperating, doing web rings and all that, but they're also competing for content, and it's true of almost every one of these nodes. One of the things that you do in a specialized network is you have to make allocation decisions. Who do I give to what, when? And when the player is running that specialized network, that becomes one of the primary decisions the player is faced with. And a lot of these type of dynamics are interesting not only in terms of simulated system, but in terms of what is the strategic consideration of the player. Another one is allocation of time, which we call priority. I've got a limited amount of time, how am I going to allocate it? Space Invaders is kind of an easy example of that. These little things are coming down at me, blasting at me. How am I going to spend my time? Which one do I shoot first? And basically, this game is a game of priority. This is my cat, Houdini. He's got extra toes. So another one is mapping. And mapping is kind of forming temporary networks, usually for some functional performance reason. It's almost like specialization in a way, but it's really a much more temporary phenomena. Tetris is almost kind of a mapping game where these blocks fall from the top, and you very quickly have to map them to the best slot on the bottom that will give you the highest functional score in Tetris. A lot of fighting games are mapping games. When I play this, I love this game. This is Godzilla, Destroy All Monsters, kind of a fighting game. But my opponent picks Godzilla, so I pick Mechagodzilla. There's a mapping against my opponent. There's also a mapping of what weapons I use against him. And in this game, it basically, once you realize that you can pick up the buildings and throw them, it doesn't matter who you pick, because all the battles end up being throwing buildings back and forth. But state machines basically do internal mapping. And state machines are all about mapping themselves to current circumstances. There's an environmental situation. The state machine kind of recognizes that and then has a fixed number of responses. They try to map the correct response to give the appropriate behavior for that environment. And state machines also happen very much more overtly at the gameplay level. This is Battlefield 42. And whenever I play this game, I think of this game in terms of a mapping game. I come into the game, and which vehicle am I going to pick today? And that vehicle I pick is going to be very dependent on what battle is going on. But of course, half the time it ends up being the Jeep, because it's so cool that they designed a game here where the Jeep is more interesting than the battleship. And different players will actually make different mapping decisions in this game. So for a given situation, each player, they might feel better, they might have more skill with the vehicle, or they want to go after this particular guy who's in another vehicle, or whatever. But with a different situation, they'll make different mapping decisions. And the mapping decisions aren't just individual to them in the situation, but also to what the other members of their team have picked. If nobody on your team has picked an airplane and you need one, then people will change their decisions. And so it's kind of an interesting mapping decision you make playing this game as to which vehicle you're going to go jump in. I just have to tell you this really quick. It's kind of off topic, but there's this cool level in Battlefield 42 where I think it's Market Garden, You get in a German Jeep, and you drive as fast as you can through the battle, just weaving and avoiding everything, and you go way back into the Americans' back line where all the American airfields are. And there's this flat field with the airplanes, and then these wide bowls up on the side. And it's like a skate park. You get on the Jeep, and you go up one side, and then down and up the other side. In the meantime, the Americans are spawning in this flat area. So it's kind of like up there, splat, 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 up there, splat, splat, splat. And I thought this was interesting because for me, all of a sudden in my mind, it just clicked that this was a beautiful combination of Grand Theft Auto, Tony Hawk Pro Skater, and Battlefield 42. And it was just, it's a great level. It really is. In online games, we have a lot of mapping decisions to make. One of the primary ones is made by the players themselves. You come into a game, and there are all these other players, and who do I go hang out with or interact with? Right now, this is pretty much happenstance. But I think one of the more interesting things about the future of online games is we're getting to the point where we can now start helping them make those mappings more and more accurately. You know, when I come into a game of, let's say, 100,000 people, there's probably 1 or 2 people in that game that I would just totally hit it off with. And if we can somehow facilitate the navigation of me finding that person, I'm just going to have a blast with your game if I pick the right person to play with. One of the things we're doing is we're taking metrics that we're collecting on the social interactions that people are doing in the game and trying to figure out if we can use that as a basis for making these mapping decisions. Now, you're probably at this point in the talk asking what's the point of all this. But kind of back to the original point is that what we really want with all of these dynamics is to engineer emergence. So I want to talk a little bit about how these components work together and at some point become really much more than the sum of their parts. Imagine a situation where we have a number of agents sitting here competing in some format. At some point, some of the agents realize that they can start cooperating. And in cooperating, they get a competitive advantage against the other agents. At that point, you know, they're almost like a meta node now. Now, as that happens, you know, they start out-competing all the individual agents that are not, you know, grouping together. And at some point, a new level of competition emerges between these higher-level agents. Basically, this keeps going on, and basically, you can end up with these very nested sets of specialized systems interacting. And at every level, they're both competing with the individuals and cooperating, that balance again. We still have the same original topologies. We have agents, we have networks, we have layers. A lot of the natural world around us can be understood in terms of this emergence. Basically, we have physics at the low level, you know, which emerges up to chemistry, biology, and then up to really interesting stuff. At each one of these levels of emergence, the possibilities get richer. So chemistry has a much richer set of possibilities than physics. Biology has a much richer set of possibilities than chemistry. And the same thing is true of games. With a game like Grand Theft Auto, you know, it has an underlying physics model. Built on top of that are the way the vehicles and the people behave. From that are built missions, and then from the missions are built this whole overall story game arc. So it's a wonderful example of emergence in the system. And so at every level that you can achieve upwards in that, your players are rewarded with a much richer possibility set that they can explore. This is kind of a toy example called SimWar. And by the way, you cannot imagine how many times people have suggested that we do SimWar. Like it hasn't been done a million times already. But in this game, we basically have production units, offense, and defense. Those are the only units in the game. Very simple rules. Each unit has a cost. The military units can blow up the factory. There's a 50-50 chance between the military units, but the defensive units cost a lot less than the offensive. Okay, that's the rules of this simple kind of toy game. Now, at the beginning of this game, I'm the black player. You know, I'm going to decide, what do I do now? What I have to do, it obviously is dependent on what the red player does. You know, if I think the red player is going to send offensive units after me, I'm better off building defensive units, which are much cheaper to defend. On the other hand, if I think the red player is going to go for production, my best strategy is to build some tanks and go in and blow them away early. On the other hand, if he's going to build defensive units, then I want to not even bother attacking and build up my production faster than he does. So there's this kind of orthogonal design here, you know, basically known as paper, rock, scissors, that's really nice because there's no strategic convergence. There's no one strategy that wins, and it's entirely a mapping decision if I map correctly to the other player's intentions. At the outside of a game like this, I can either lose or win very easily if I pick the right mapping. Otherwise, as the game progresses and more units enter into it, it's not going to be resolved so quickly, and it becomes a much more kind of fuzzy issue. But think about all the decisions that the player has to make just in deciding what to produce next. First of all, I have to decide, am I going to go for short-term, try to win early with military units, or long-term, go for production? Am I going to go for a high-risk, high-reward? again, by going with military, or low risk, low reward by going with production and defense. There's an allocation decision I have to make. What am I spending on these different units? There's order. What order do I produce these things in? There's supplier networks that kind of evolve out of this game. There are boundaries that are formed, as we start fighting and it gets a little bit more static. So I think it was Sid Meier that said that, the role of a game designer, it really is to give the player a very rich set of decisions to make in playing the game. And in this case, we took this very simple little rule set, and I'm showing how all these considerations collapse into that one simple decision of what do I build next. And that implies kind of a strategic emergence of the game, which is kind of a different type of emergence, a little bit separate from the dynamics themselves. It's more in the rule set. I'm going to recap here just a little bit how these components interact kind of in one model, as I understand it, is that we have competition in a system which drives growth. Growth eventually starts giving rise to grouping for competitive reasons. Grouping is enabled by control structures, and they give rise to boundaries that delineate the groups. Eventually, specialization emerges from the grouping here. Specialization relies upon propagation of material and information through networks. These networks feed back into the group and control structures that were pre-existing. The propagation actually involves making allocation decisions of what node gets what. The networks involve mapping decision, how to connect these nodes together, what is the map of the system. And then at some point, the system can kind of transcend to the next level, and that's the nesting or the jumping, level jumping that we saw earlier. At that point, the entire competition can start over again at a higher level. So this is kind of one view over how a lot of these dynamics typically interrelate in interesting systems. Now, the last thing I want to talk about here is paradigms. These are the way that these systems have been understood through time. And it's interesting to see them in their historical order because I think you can understand them much easier if you understand what the world model was when they were designed. Paradigms really are not reality, and it's pretty important to remember that. We have two theories in physics. We have relativity theory, which explains the behavior of large-scale things, gravity, planets, whatnot. And we have quantum mechanics, which explains very small things. Both of these theories are excellent. They fit reality so well, it's amazing. But the thing is that they're incompatible with each other. They don't talk the same language. They just will not plug into each other. So because of that, it's pretty obvious that these are not reality. They might do a good job of representing their areas of reality, but reality is something else entirely different underneath these theories, these paradigms. And what's kind of ironic here is that neither one of these theories can really adequately describe a duck, or any life form, or interesting complex system, And that's where calculus has really kind of hit a brick wall, or traditional math techniques. As we approach these more elaborate, interesting systems, that's where simulation has really shown to have the upper hand. Again, kind of looking at how the point in time changes your view, I'm going to take a quick look at futurism here, and I think there's some lessons to be learned here. Futurism, this is kind of historical futurism, where we go back to the turn of the century, Fritz Lang's Metropolis. His view of what the future was going to be was heavily weighed by what was happening in his here and now. So at that point in time, skyscrapers were being invented. So he understood the future as, it's going to be a world of skyscrapers. When the interstate system was first built, this is kind of a view of the future that we would have. This actually came pretty close to being true. We have this like SUV-looking thing that's really top-heavy, and the people in the car, they're obviously not driving. They're like having a cocktail party or something. But that's unfortunately pretty close to reality, I think. When nuclear power was invented, the atom bomb, they said, okay, in 10 years we'll have atomic-powered airplanes and cars. This is actually a Ford design, the Ford Nucleon. And it was nice of them to put the reactor a good 5 feet behind the passenger compartment. And this is when the chemical industry was big, and I guess the future was everybody wearing badly fitting polyester suits or something. This is the DuPont's Wonderful World of Chemistry musical. When 2001 came out, it just seemed like a no-brainer that by 2001 we'd be living on the moon, have these giant space stations and stuff. And more recently, the computer revolution, internet around us. Now we have a lot of these kind of dystopian views of the future with, us wired all over the place. Basically, the first paradigm in simulation I want to talk about very briefly here is cybernetics. This came out more like in the 40s as we were trying to study biological systems and understand control structures. A lot of control theory came out of this. The thermostat in your house is basically a cybernetic system. It has an input, which is the temperature sensor. It regulates and then sends output to your furnace to try to keep a certain level. Basically, as soon as our machines were getting complex enough to need simple nervous systems, that's when cybernetics theory came along. Things like autopilots were prime examples. They found that they could chain these simple feedback things together and get much more elaborate kind of control-seeking behavior. A lot of analog electronics kind of resulted from this approach. There even were analog computers back when, and these things were really finicky and hard to work with, but they were pretty interesting that they were taking that approach in an analog format. It really hit a brick wall because at some point, so many stages deep into the system, there's no way you could tune it. And this was way before they understood complexity theory, which was kind of limiting the usefulness of this. They didn't understand the theoretical limitations of these at the time. The next big paradigm that kind of came along was this thing called system dynamics, invented by a guy named J. Forrester. He's the same guy who invented the magnetic core memory. Now, system dynamics understands everything in the world in terms of two paradigms, stocks and flows. Everything around you is either a stock or a flow. So in this population model, population is a stock, and birth and death rates are flows. If the birth rate is higher than the death rate, the population will accumulate over time. This model kind of came out of the chemical industry, as near as I can tell. It was getting very large around the time that he invented this. And in fact, if you look at a typical system dynamics model, it shows a lot of similarity to chemical flow models. The thing about system dynamics is you can seemingly apply it to anything, which really excited a lot of people at the time. I was surfing the web, and I actually found this system dynamics model of some individual. This is how he attained religious enlightenment. And so this is a model. If you look at the things on there, it's like the trueness of his prayer, his fear of death, psychic energy factor. And then he had runs of the model, and you can see that his trueness of mind was increasing over time, even though his prayer quality was kind of in the cyclic range. But you can apply these models to anything, which makes them kind of interesting. There was an influential book that Jay Forrester wrote along with this couple, the Meadows, called Limits to Growth, back in the 60s. And they had this thing called the world dynamic model, where it was a model of the way the entire world worked in system dynamics. And they were predicting that there would be vast famine and horrible things happening around 1985. They were running this in 1960. What they didn't realize, again, was chaos theory could have told them, basically, the system was too chaotic to predict that far in advance. They just got a few factors off by like 10%. And because of that, the amplification of those factors through the system, their model was nowhere near reality when it came around to it. Cellular Automata is one of my favorites. This was actually the idea that you have a grid of cells and they interact with very simple rules, fixed discrete time steps. This was basically invented by a guy named von Neumann. And this was one of the really first true-to-digital computation methods that came up. And one of the cool things about this is the emergence out of cellular automata systems. I'm going to show you another prototype here. This one's called Biome. There was actually a very influential simulation that von Neumann did that probably most of you have seen, I'm sure, called Life. How many of you have played with Life? Actually, Conway's Life, not von Neumann's. Okay. But basically, it's an extremely simple system. You have a cell can be alive or dead. And I'll show you a pattern here. This is called the R pentamono. In fact, of these elaborate taxonomies of these patterns. And certain people, myself included, have gotten just obsessed with this game for long periods of time. I won't tell you how much time I wasted playing with this. But there are only two simple rules to life, and it says that you look at your neighbors and count them. If you have 3 or 4 neighbors and you're alive, you remain alive. Otherwise, you die. If you're an empty cell and you have 4 neighbors exactly, you come to life. That's the entire rule set. And what's interesting is the elaborate, complicated emergent structures that can come out of those simple rules. This is one of the best examples that people just kind of stood back and started to understand the idea of emergence. How could these simple, incredibly simple little rules give rise to these things that were almost like ecosystems? You can actually study life for years, and some people have. There are websites, just do a web search, and you'll find how intensely some people have studied this ecosystem, this little world. There are other things you can do. We can change the rule structures just slightly so that the cells don't have to have just one state. In this case, it's a multi-state, and that's what the different colors represent. These are the little things that are gliding around, and they're leaving trails, and the trails have kind of a stochastic evaporation behind them, We used a technique like this in Sim Life. The creatures moved around, and there was a CA layer underneath them that left basically scent trails. And other creatures could track the scent trails and follow them and eat them if they could follow the scent trail accurately enough. So you can get fairly flexible with CAs. I'll show you another one really quick here, which is a model of a forest growing. And of course, the forest, first thing I want to do is burn it down. So I'll put a fire in. So this is basically a fire spreading model, propagation of fire through a forest. You'll notice on the inside, the forest is regrowing now. Again, the rule structures for these are just remarkably simple. As a matter of fact, in terms of prototyping, what we do with these things is we try to make them very easy to script. So this is the entire rule set for the forest fire simulator. And in fact, most of the rules really are right there. And anybody can write this in a text file. And so when we do a prototype like this, the prototype is kind of ground zero. And then we sit there and write a lot of different rule sets and explore all these different states of where we can get to with this prototype. I'll load one more here to show you the uses of a two-dimensional cellular automata. This is kind of a model roughly simulating national borders or bacteriological cultures, any type of system like this where the borders are being slowly mutated over time based on some underlying rule set. In this one, there actually is a separate layer underneath. And this is the layer that resolves the conflicts up on the borders up here. And so these layers, the layer under here is basically saying who's winning the battle up here. And in fact, layering CAs together turns out to be a very powerful technique. SimCity, in fact, can be thought of as a three-dimensional cellular automata. We have layers for different things. On top of that, we have also objects that are kind of outside the CA. But within the CA layers, we've seen lots of emergence. There's when we first did the second SimCity, SimCity 2000, we turned it on, and over some time, people started saying, oh, wow, that's really cool the way you programmed in inner city decay. And I went back and looked at it, and in fact, yeah, really big cities, eventually the land value would collapse, people would start moving out, and it would really look like inner city decay. But we never programmed that into the system. In fact, it turned out it was kind of a positive feedback between these rules, and it was a natural result of the emergence of these different layers that were able to read each other. And so these layers aren't just calculating what's in their layer, but also looking at layers above and below them to get their new values. Something like SimCity really is a hybrid model. We have CA layers underneath that do a lot of the local propagation of information. But on top of that, we have something that's closer to a traditional system dynamics model, which is influencing which industries are growing, more the long-term global things. And so really, it's the balance between the global system dynamics model and the local cellular automata model in SimCity that gives it the interesting behavior. Now, chaos theory is more recent, and chaos theory itself is fairly simple. I mean, it basically just says that I can roll a ball down here, or I can move the ball over just a little bit, and it'll go to an entirely different direction. Certain systems have this property that if I change the initial conditions a little bit, it can have a vast change in the output of the system. On the other hand, if I invert that ball and drop two balls in from different directions, they'll end up in the same spot. So this is a very stable system. A lot of the interesting stuff that came out of chaos theory, in fact, was more visualization-oriented, ways to visualize phase space. I'm going to kind of skip ahead a little bit here. These are different phase space diagrams. These are ways to visualize systems through time and space at the same time and get a sense of them. This is actually kind of a phase space diagram of the Sims players going through game space, a statistical description of how many of them spent money on their house, how many friends they had, how much money they were accumulating. And so it's kind of a cloud of the possibility space that the players were inhabiting. And we can look at the densest areas where the most players were. One thing that kind of came out of chaos theory is the idea that there is this continuum between disordered systems and highly ordered systems. And the most complex systems that we know of are chaotic and exist right in the middle of this range. The chaos theory was really trying to form a general theory of complexity, but for the most part it failed. But a lot of the tools that came out of chaos theory have proven to be very useful. The next system I want to talk about are complex adaptive systems. And these are the systems that a lot of these things we're trying to really study. And these are things like industry, biology, economics. These are systems that have defied most traditional analysis up to now. You can look at something like a watch, and it's obviously a very complex system, but it's not adaptive. It's very brittle. If you bend one little gear in there, it's going to break. Biological systems, on the other hand, are very flexible. They can take a lot of abuse and go back and heal themselves and repair. Some systems, we've made attempts to do that through things like redundancy. The Russian space program, if you'll notice, their rockets always have all these nozzles. One of the reasons was that they couldn't build a very efficient turbopump for the rockets. They had like 20% failure rate. But they had a brilliant solution, and they just designed 30% more engine than they needed. And they had every turbopump drive 2 opposite nozzles. So if a turbopump went out, the rocket was still balanced. So it was a way to make the thing still work, in overcoming. It was a lot cheaper to solve the problem that way than to get to the engineering tolerances they needed to build better rocket motors. So these adaptive systems are very much like cybernetic systems, where they have kind of an input and an output, and there's a feedback loop. What differentiates them is that there's an internal rule set. There's some sort of internal mapping where learning is going on, and they're trying to improve their performance over time, unlike cybernetic systems, which had fixed performance over time. Some of the technologies for doing this are like genetic algorithms, neural networks, et cetera. Adaptive landscapes kind of came from biology, but they've been applied to adaptive systems, and this is the idea that these systems are doing hill climbing over time. These systems are able to increase their performance by trying small perturbations of their current mapping, measuring, is it better to be here or is it better to be here? In a game, it might be, I'm going to try the tank this time, and next time I'm going to try the Jeep, and next time the airplane. And if I did really well in the tank, I'm going to pick the tank next time and maybe try a different type of tank. And so it's excessive approximation of performance. And this really is a concept of biology and evolution. Gameplay, I've used that a lot. This is a tremendously useful model for me of a player going through a possibility space, encountering challenges, basically trying to do hill climbing in the challenge space of the game. This is kind of a gameplay map for The Sims that, the way we thought about it, where there was a social material dimensions to success, but really you had to balance the two and go right up the middle to achieve the highest levels of success. So this brings us to network theory. Like I said, I'm not going to cover this too deep, but it's important to know that networks come in all shapes and sizes, but we're finding that the most interesting networks around us share a very interesting property, which is called the scale of the network. The internet is a prime example. Before I kind of go into that, I'm going to show you another demo how networks can be used kind of in emergence. This demo was written by Chaim Jingold that was an intern for me at Maxis. Well, actually, we'll just start with a simple system here. Now, in this system, we have specialized agents. And in this case, we have red, green, and blue. I can put down some agents here. You can see they start spouting little particles. Now, when the particles hit another agent, they'll actually form a connection, and certain behaviors result from this. They'll still actually share. They're propagating information and material through these networks that are forming spontaneously. I can actually turn up the node creation rate. I can actually make nodes spontaneously appear very rapidly, and we'll see the behavior of the system. Now, the number of nodes links that I'm allowing here is 2. I can cut that back to 1, and the system gets less viscous, much more free-flowing. If I turn the number of connections up to 5, these things start glomming together. They become like molasses and start forming these larger associations. A system like that is very interesting in terms of its emergence, how one little thing can totally change the character of the entire system. Let me show you a couple more models in this. This is a model of a creature. Now, we have different specialized nodes in this one. These little blue things on the edges are eye stalks that are looking for food. The green things are movement nodes, and this middle thing is a mouth. So this is like a little octopus guy crawling around looking for food. I can move all the food up here, and then he'll eventually kind of sense it and move over there. These nodes also have to be fed. You'll notice that some nodes are larger than others. The mouth converts the incoming particles into energy and sends it back out through the network, and there's an allocation decision made at every node, whether, do I keep the food or pass it on down the network? And if it's around away from food too long, these nodes will starve and start to die. And then as they die, a death of a node in this thing can really debilitate the creature. So certain ones can be more robust. They can have 2 stomachs, 2 eyes. But this is an example of using networks, specialization, propagation, all these things to kind of create an emergent system. I'll show you another one here. These guys are like little sessile creatures, and they eat light particles and have their own little kind of cyclic-like life cycle going on here. Just to illustrate, the center node here is actually a specialized node where they do most of their processing. If I go into a creature here and I kill it, its central node, you'll see that the other ones can't survive. They were dependent on that central node. They'll eventually kind of wither away and die. And the same is true of these guys up here if they don't get enough food. If I stop feeding them light particles in the system, they will die very rapidly. But you can see how these systems have a very lifelike property to them. And they're very non-intuitive as you start playing with these things. I'll show you another one really quick here. This is an interesting guy in that it eats primarily on the inside of the network is where it's most likely to get fed new particles. And so what happens is that as its outer layers are withering and dying, they get pulled inside to eat. So this creature is continually turning itself inside out to eat. And that's the digestive process of this thing. And this is totally emergent. This fairly, very complex life cycle behavior is totally emergent from a few simple rules interacting. So let me speed up a little bit more here. About networks, one of the important things is that there's a power law distribution, which means that a few nodes have a lot of links, and if most nodes have very few links. And that's how these networks balance kind of between the local and global communication. You can look at any game like Sims Online, and you see this power law distribution. The most popular players, people in these networks can also leave comments for each other. This is the most popular player we have in our biggest city. Ralph Koster actually was telling me in his talk that he thought we shouldn't be visualizing this because other companies would want to come in and steal our best players. One thing about her is that she's connected with all these different little groups and decided to start a mafia in our game. And she has her own alternate topology, and they even have these price lists for what it takes to do a hit or a raid on somebody else. And they're doing griefing in a very interesting way because all the communication takes place out of game, so we can't track them. They don't want the feds listening in. So, Raph, if you want her, she's yours. Please take her. And this is stuff that Raph covered in his talk yesterday about the value of weak links in the system. But I think my time is up. I want to give special thanks to these guys who worked on the prototypes I showed you today. And this is the address where you can find this talk on the web. And thank you for coming, everybody.